Hawaii rarely, if ever, grants permission to citizens to carry guns in public for personal protection. Gun enthusiasts say that violates their Second Amendment right in the U.S. Constitution. The issue will go before the U.S. Supreme Court next month as justices hear arguments in a similar case from New York. Will Hawaii become an open carry state? Tonight's live broadcast and live stream of insights on PBS Hawaii start now.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Yenji Denise. A permit to openly carry a handgun in Hawaii is granted in only exceptional cases. Big Island resident George Young applied for a permit to carry a loaded firearm in public with the Hawaii County Police Department 3 separate times and was rejected each time. He filed a lawsuit claiming the rejections violated his Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. A 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco sided with Young, but later the full court sided with the state and upheld the denials. Next month, the U.S. Supreme Court will hear arguments in a similar case from New York where gun advocates are challenging that state's gun permitting laws. We look forward to your participation in tonight's show. You can email or call us with your questions, and you'll find a live stream of this program at pbshawaii.org and on the PBS Hawaii Facebook page. Now to our guests. Chris Marvin is a former Army Black Hawk helicopter pilot and a combat wounded veteran. He leads the Veteran Engagement Strategy for Everytown for Gun Safety, the nation's largest gun prevention organization. He also sits on Everytown's Veteran Advisory Council. Former Marine Kainoa Kaku is the owner of Maka'ala Financial Services. Active in the Hawaii Rifle Association, Kaku joined the HRA Board of Directors in 2016 and currently serves as the association's president. Director of the law firm Starn, O'Toole, Marcus & Fisher, Doug Chin has served as both the Lieutenant Governor and the Attorney General of the state of Hawaii. Mr. Chin has been named to the Best Lawyers in America list and has experience with Supreme Court cases. Kevin O'Grady is an attorney with extensive experience in Second Amendment and firearm litigation. He is a member of the American Council of Second Amendment Lawyers and a command judge advocate in the U.S. Army Reserve. And Avi Soifer is a constitutional law professor and was the dean of the University of Hawaii Richardson School of Law from 2003 to 2020. Soifer graduated from Yale Law School and served as dean of Boston College Law School before moving to Hawaii. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for being here for this very important discussion. Avi, I want to start with you. Tell us about the case that is going to be before the Supreme Court and its implications right here at home.
Well, as you mentioned, the New York case is quite similar to the situation here. It's an association, as it happens. It's the New York Rifle and Pistol Association. And they say, we want to be able to carry our guns outside our homes. We are people who believe in them, and we are concerned about target practice and so on, and we're not allowed to do it. And New York has a way in which you're allowed if you show cause. And we have a similar show proper cause as to why you might want to carry your gun outside. The Heller case, which the Supreme Court decided in 2008, was the first time the Second Amendment won for individual rights. And it was about your defense in your home. So these cases, after 13 years, are the first ones, that is to say the New York case, the first one that the Supreme Court has taken. But even the Heller case left open, we will have some regulations. Let's see which ones are constitutional.
And if gun advocates prevail in that case, what will that mean for us here in Hawaii?
Well, a lot depends on what the court says. They might say very limited, show proper cause. They might say, we're not so concerned about defense of yourself, or you have to defend yourself outside your home. So it depends on how broadly or narrowly they write it. Here, as you mentioned, we've had George Young trying now for almost 10 years to challenge that permit to get a gun outside his home. And he's won at first, and then the Ninth Circuit has gone in bank, as it's called, and he's lost 7-4 twice in the Ninth Circuit. Each time Judge Clifton, our Judge Clifton on the Ninth Circuit, sort of predicted, well, I know what's going to happen. We all know what's going to happen, which is he's had a sort of back and forth with the judge who decided against George, in favor of George Young. Clifton was against, and he said they're going to reverse this in bank, and they did.
Kevin, what's your take on the current situation here in Hawaii and the case that's now going before the U.S. Supreme Court?
Well, and thank you for having me here tonight. I appreciate it. And as Avi said, the Hawaii case and the New York case are similar. Mr. Young asked for the ability to carry openly or concealed. It didn't really matter. And I think what is important, and this was just filed today when New York filed a reply, the petitioners in the New York case. The problem with Hawaii and with New York is that the states view the Second Amendment right as a privilege that only certain people under certain circumstances can carry in certain ways when they get permission from somebody, a bureaucrat, a police chief. And so I think that Avi is correct again. What is the Supreme Court going to tell us? The Second Amendment is very much in its infancy, and the justices need to provide us with a framework. I think there is, and I don't mean to try to prognosticate on what they're going to say, but I think that there are several members of the U.S. Supreme Court that are not happy with the way some of the courts of appeals have been applying the Second Amendment, and this will maybe give them an opportunity to give us a framework within which to apply certain laws. And I think that it's just the show presumes there's going to be some ability to carry outside. And I think that if you look at it as other rights are treated, it's going to be a broad right. But yes, there will be some legislation that can occur, but it's going to flip the script the way states like Hawaii look at it, which is that you can almost never have the ability to carry outside your home unless somebody should give you what's completely a completely discretionary permit. And that, I think, is going to change.
Doug, what's your take on this? And if you could elaborate a little bit on these exceptional cases, who does get to carry a gun here in Hawaii right now?
Sure. I mean, without question, Hawaii has some of the strictest gun laws in the country. Yeah, I mean, I think it's we've had a very sophisticated legal argument so far in terms of like how the U.S. Supreme Court is going to be ruling on this, but I think the viewpoint of a lot of the policymakers here, I mean, I think I share that as well, is that when you look at the state, I was a prosecutor for 13 years. I was the attorney general for 4 years. I mean, I think one of the things that Hawaii is well known for is that it just has a very low crime rate. And then even the crime that does occur tends to be property crimes, not violent crimes. I mean, I think I end up making that leap that, well, I think it has to do with the fact that, we have very strict gun laws that really protect everyone's public safety. Some people might say that's too big of a leap or that's not an appropriate one to make. I think so. I mean, I think that it makes common sense that that's what, that if you have strict gun laws that keep these kinds of weapons out of the hands of people who would not be safe if they had it, or the people that are around them, then that kind of regulation makes sense. And so it is going to be interesting to see how the U.S. Supreme Court rules on this. I think for a very long time, it felt like the U.S. Supreme Court would basically be like, okay, states, you guys can do whatever you want. So some states will have strict laws, some states won't, but we'll let the states figure it out. But I think we are poised to potentially have some sort of direction from the current U.S. Supreme Court that may turn things a little bit in terms of how the states look at it.
And under that exceptional case threshold, who actually does get to carry a gun?
Well, I think it is an appropriate discretionary decision that is made the top law enforcement officer, who is then able to decide whether or not someone is able to carry a firearm. I don't think it's not an issue of whether or not people get to carry. I mean, I think the biggest issue has to do with the fact that someone who is in charge of law enforcement is able to make that kind of decision, and it works. It's actually something that works so far. We have the gun laws that we have for good reason, and it's kept people safe so far.
Okay,
May I
Noah, I want to
interject?
give you an opportunity to jump in here. Is there a demand for people to be able to carry a firearm right now? I heard you say no one, essentially.
No one, yeah. I think Doug did a really good job of jumping around the question, and the answer is no one gets to carry, because our police chiefs have declared and decreed that no one gets to carry. Is there demand? Absolutely. There's a huge demand. There's a huge demand for training. There's a huge demand for being able to defend yourself outside the home, wherever you choose to go, because I don't know about you, but I don't lock myself inside my house 24 hours a day. So while the Heller decision was great in protecting the ability, guaranteeing the ability to protect yourself inside the home with a firearm, it does nothing for you once you leave the door. And if you've paid any attention to the news, gun crime exists in Hawaii. Criminals have guns. Criminals use guns to commit crimes. But it's us, the law-abiding citizenship of Hawaii, that are unable to carry firearms for self-defense. In fact, up until recently, we couldn't even carry tasers, and we're still unclear on how that's going to go. Although the courts decided that we are going to get tasers for self-defense, now we're trying to decide the bureaucracy that goes in the way of being able to be able to use a taser for self-defense.
Chris, I want to get your take. What are your concerns if the Supreme Court does widen these restrictions, if you will, and does allow for people in Hawaii to carry guns?
I think that, simply put, a Supreme Court decision that sides with the NRA here will ensure that people in our state experience more gun violence, right? We've seen it in other states, not the exact example, but we've seen when fire permitting laws have been weakened over a short period of time, those states experience an increase in handgun homicides. And the increase is usually of the order of about 10, 11%. That's what we can expect to see in Hawaii. More guns, more violence, more death. Moreover, this court decision, if they were to deliver this verdict, it would be unpopular with most Americans, right? So 9 out of 10 Americans think that a person should have to have a permit before carrying a gun in public. And so I haven't seen polling specifically on what Hawaii residents say, but it would probably be less popular here, right? And it speaks to our citizens' desire to keep the laws that we have to keep us all safe.
Doug, there's
May I respond?
Please go ahead.
Yes, so a couple of things. I noticed Doug said that he felt that the current policy considerations that are in place with a law enforcement officer making these kind of decisions and using that discretion, that sort of boundless discretion is exactly what brought the Young case and the New York case to the Supreme Court, because what it results in is a de facto ban. And Heller tells us that when you have that sort of boundless discretion, as opposed to being able to apply, perhaps if the court decides, strict scrutiny in a limited fashion to certain people in certain areas they perhaps may not be able to carry, again, looking through the wrong end of the telescope here, they said certain policy decisions are off the table. So our kind of setup that we have here, where it's in the hands of the county chiefs, and all the county chiefs uniformly have said nobody under any circumstances in the general public meets a very, very narrow set of circumstances, which nobody knows what they are because nobody has a concealed or an open carry permit here, and that it becomes a de facto ban. That kind of law is very unlikely to survive if we have a court that views it sort of the same way that Heller did. I'm not going to tell you what they're going to say. I have no idea, but I think that there's a very strong likelihood that when you have regimes such as Hawaii and New York, what you're going to see is a restoration of rights that people have always had. It's just places like Hawaii and New York have buried it under this de facto ban and called it discretion.
Right.
And it doesn't matter really whether or not it's popular or unpopular. I'm sure Heller wasn't popular for some people either, but it is what the Constitution says.
Well, let me say a few things about what Heller does say, and it really doesn't talk about discretion. The facts were terrific facts for the gun owner, who was a security guard. It was a federal case because it was DC. And he said, these are very strict gun regulations. I have to take my gun apart. I'm worried about my safety. There was a lot of gun violence in Washington, DC at the time. He won, but he won because Justice Scalia for the court said some strange things to one extent, but certainly didn't go into these regulation questions about what follows Heller. the Second Amendment, everyone runs around as if they know what the Second Amendment says. Let me say for a moment, what the Second Amendment says. It says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's about a militia, it's about groups. So he says, well, naturally it has two clauses so that he can talk about the second and not the first. So that is interesting for someone who says he's a textualist. It's also the case that he says, let's look at history. He has a history argument, and Justice Stevens has a history argument. But what he says in terms of limitations on this right, if it's a long-standing rule, there's a presumption in favor of the regulation. He also says, we're not going to say any gun. We're going to sort of look at what was going on in the 1790s when they passed this thing. And he didn't talk about showing cause and so on. And we've had a lot of courts dividing on that question over the last 13 years. But the text does not answer the question. And in Hawaii, in 1852, there was a very strong regulation of deadly weapons. And in 1927, when it was already a territory, a very strong regulation. So it is longstanding in Hawaii, and therefore might well fit within what even Justice Scalia said would be allowed. We don't know what the court's
I want to get to some of these viewer
With res-
questions. Let's get this one over to Doug. Shannon from Hawaii Kai says, if there is an open carry, how are you going to test and check on mental stability? When this is done in other states, how is this carried out so that this is done in a safe way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the problem. And I think what you come up with is kind of like two ways to look at the world. I mean, I think what I heard, Kainoa say, and I respect the viewpoint, is this idea of, I want to be able to walk around with a firearm because it's my right and because it helps me to feel safe. I tend to belong to that other school of thought where I don't feel safe at all. If I have this sense that people are just walking around with firearms without any good sense of regulation of them. When I first became a prosecutor about 3 years in, that was when the Xerox shooting happened. My boss, who was my mentor, one of my first mentors, Peter Carlisle, he was the person who prosecuted Byron Uisugi. 7 people shot at the Xerox building just off Nimitz Highway. I can't even drive past there without remembering that. I remember how much it affected our office when it happened. I remember how much it affected the state. And so even though that's something that's 21 years ago, I refuse to forget that was an instance of a mass shooting that really shook Hawaii to the core and was something that was so out of character for someone. And this was somebody who had registered firearms, who was not being checked in terms of where his mental health and mental stability was. So I think since then, I think what the legislature has done here that's been really helpful is they have been able to pass more and more laws to really be able to make sure that people do submit to background checks, that they do take a firearm safety course, things that help people who properly could be able to carry a firearm or be able to own a firearm and possess one, are people who are actually going through the proper checks to really be able to qualify them to be able to do something like that. And when I say qualify, I mean qualifying in terms of public safety. And I think ultimately that's what it boils down to. Some people feel safe if everyone's able to go around carrying a firearm. I don't feel that way. I feel safe knowing that there are appropriate regulations in place that's able to make sure that it's kept out of the hands of people that do mass violence and even domestic violence or other things that really hurt and potentially cause great injury to people.
Okay, Noah, let's get to another question here, which is what Doug is touching on, which is why do people need to carry a firearm outside in public?
I mean, why do people need to go outside? It's not my business, right? It's a constitutionally protected right to be able to protect yourself. I think that if we had an English professor on, we could talk about what a well-regulated militia was back when the Constitution was written. And well-regulated didn't mean have a bunch of laws in the way to make sure that the right people have guns. No, well-regulated meant well-trained. And that's what we strive to do with the Hawaii Rifle Association, is take people who are fresh, who want to learn how to defend themselves, defend their families, and teach to go about doing that. But as for Doug bringing up Byron Uisugi, I could have asked Doug the question, what laws would have prevented Byron from doing what he did? And I know the answer, none, because he legally owned all of those firearms that he used to commit a crime. It's all it takes for someone to be a criminal is to do acts of crime, right? If someone has evil intent in their heart, they're going to do evil, right? In Nice, France, in 2016, an individual used a semi truck to kill 86 people and wound almost 500. It doesn't matter what the tool is. The evil intent is going to do evil, right? So what we want is the ability to protect ourselves in the event that evil occurs. And it's a constitutionally protected right. The fact that it's only now going to the Supreme Court boggles the mind. But I'm glad we're gonna have a definitive answer, because living in Hawaii, if you're a gun rights guy in Hawaii, you have got to be an optimist. otherwise we wouldn't do this, right?
Well, Chris, let's get your take on this question. Why do people need to carry a firearm outside in public? What's your response?
I mean, I think that you hear folks talking about the Second Amendment. There's the Second Amendment, therefore I should be able to carry my gun wherever I want. And what they're echoing is the NRA's current agenda, right? The NRA's current agenda is guns everywhere for everybody, no questions asked, right? And why is that their agenda? That's their agenda because they represent gun manufacturers and they want to make more money. More guns sold means more money for gun manufacturers. I think, speaking sort of to the audience today that might be gun owners, I think it's important to understand that the issue we're talking about, specifically the Supreme Court case, isn't about owning a gun legally. It's not about protecting your family. It's not about collecting guns or hunting. This is not actually an anti-gun versus pro-gun debate. Don't just jump on the pro-gun side because you own a gun or you like guns. This is actually about people who want to keep their kids safe versus the gun lobby's attempt to increase their profits for gun manufacturers. It's your neighbors versus big corporations. So if we have less regulation, they're going to sell more guns and they're going to be happy. But as a veteran, that's not how I learned to behave around firearms, right? It sort of makes me sick to my stomach that people would tend to use a gun as a toy or a fashion accessory or a protest tool, or certainly as a political football. It's not what the framers had in mind when they wrote the Second Amendment. And I think that, it's important to remember that this is about gun manufacturers' profits. That's what the NRA is after in New York.
Kevin, I want to read a couple of these and then get your response. But we've got a couple of different, this debate obviously runs a wide spectrum. Ingrid on Facebook says, I'm so grateful for Hawaii's strict gun laws. But Mike says, I've had a carry permit in multiple states, currently hold 2 out-of-state permits. I've used a firearm in self-defense to deter a man who was attempting to rob me. When we get a Supreme Court decision, if and when that happens, there are going to be a lot of unhappy people on both, on one side or the other. We talked about this bringing some clarity to Hawaii, but how will that actually, do you think, pan out?
So if we get a decision that we expect we will, and that'll probably be in the spring, probably as late as June. I mean, I don't know, they could issue it in March or what have you. I don't know. But when they do, they're going to provide a framework, and it's going to work out that I think, again, I'm optimistic that the courts will say that it is up to the legislature to just legislate, as they mentioned in Heller, perhaps in sensitive areas. The entire state cannot be a sensitive area. Hawaii and New York have it back. Long-standing prohibitions cannot harken back to the Hawaiian kingdom. And I don't think in Heller that they were really looking at the early 20th century either. They were looking way back before that. And with regard to how this is going to work, when the legislature tries to determine what the statutory scheme is going to be with regard to carrying openly and or concealed, they're probably going to have to recognize a few things, which is, first of all, no amount of legislation can divine who is going to do something later. And we already have a database in place. Should a felon try to go get permission, assuming that some level of permission is needed to carry openly or concealed, we have a criminal database that tells us whether or not they have a felony, a violent felony conviction. But as far as everything else, I don't think that you can divine whether or not somebody has, by just checking a box, that they have some sort of mental condition. There might be some, I suppose, at the edges, but you cannot take a hammer approach and say everybody has to prove to the authority that they are not suffering from something. That's not the way rights work. And rights are not also based upon need. So I think if we can take what we saw in Heller, which is that at its core, it's about self-defense. It's about choice. And so for people who don't want to have this, they don't want to carry a weapon, fine, don't. But Doug, you said you don't feel comfortable in a place with somebody carrying a weapon, which means there's probably a lot of states, Florida and Arizona and a variety of other states that have constitutional carry, where you have no idea if the four guys sitting at the table next to you, if any one of them or if all four of them are armed. That's okay. And that's an important distinction here. You mentioned something here about tourism. I think that, and again, not trying to divine what the US Supreme Court is going to say, but concealed and open carry are two different things. Now, if you carry a rifle on your back and you're in northern Arizona, I don't think anybody's going to be concerned about that. And I don't think it matters what kind of a rifle. I don't think it matters if it carries 30 rounds or even if it's burst capable, which is a fully automatic weapon, because they allow that in several states. And that would be legal in a place like Arizona. But I think that if you carried that weapon on the beach in Waikiki, you would have a different result. And so perhaps there's room when the United States Supreme Court gives the states the tools for them to be able to legislate in some fashion. Well, we're not comfortable with open carry, but you can concealed carry all day in Hawaii. Okay, and then there's definitions. In certain states, concealed means you can't even what's called print, which means if you're carrying in concealed, but somebody can figure out you're carrying concealed, then you're violating the statute because we want it really concealed. And open can be the same thing. You can carry it mostly concealed, but if a little bit of the firearm is sticking out, then that might pass the law in that particular state.
Well, Avi, let's get to just a few more questions here, and I'm sorry to cut you off there, Kevin, but Devin and Mililani says, who makes the decision as to what is an exceptional case? Why aren't permits being issued to those who qualify?
We don't know much about that. I've heard from some of the panelists that they think nobody gets them, but there's no record, interestingly, in the Young cases. So we don't know how many people applied, what percentage. We know George Young didn't get it, and that's why he challenged it. So that presumably would be developed after the Supreme Court decides whether or not our current system works constitutionally. But I want to make another point, and maybe it needs saying. This very important right to so many people wasn't recognized in until 2008 as a federal right. Repeatedly, it lost. And so things were changed in 2008. And before 2008, you didn't hear people running around and putting up signs and protesting about not having this individual right, because they didn't have it, and it had been decided for a long time. So the Supreme Court reversed precedents, and this is all relatively new. And if we want to talk about history, there was no federal constitutional right to carry even in your home. So we're now pushing the boundaries of something that's new, and that's why the courts are quite divided, and we will see what the Supreme Court has to say.
If I could jump in very quickly, there's another case out there that specifies, and it's part of a record in another case, that I think in the last 10 years or so, there haven't been any concealed weapon permits granted by any of the counties. I can't remember the case off the top of my head, but there's already some statistics out there. It might be Peruta. Thank you.
One of the points that Doug was making is we don't have that many people perhaps who want to carry. We may have a lot of people who are happy, and so we don't know how many people have applied. That would be an important datum.
I think that Kainoa will tell you that there are several people in the firearm community that apply repeatedly, and they know they're going to get denied, and they're just doing it because. But I also think that, and I'm sorry, sir, I must disagree with you, but I think prior to the 1968 Gun Control Act and prior to the National Firearms Act in the 1930s, there were a lot of people that had firearms with them, and they had them with them inside their house, outside their house. They had automatic weapons, they had rifles, they had pistols, they concealed pistols, they did all sorts of things. And it was generally understood that people could carry outside the home. In fact, after Reconstruction, a lot of the senators were talking about what we wanted to do was ensure that freed Blacks had the ability to carry weapons with them wherever they went. Why? So that they could defend themselves versus groups like the KKK. That's something that the Congress was talking about in the 1860s. So they understood that once slaves were freed, they would have the rights as a free man, which was to carry arms wherever they went. I think that comes from the Scott decision, where he said, well, we couldn't possibly have that because then they'd be able to carry arms wherever he went. So it was presumed they could carry outside wherever they went, at least generally.
Well, I want to bring it back to here at home. And Chris, I want to get your take. Loke in Waimanalo says, does becoming an open carry state just cause people to turn to guns quicker in situations of conflict rather than other forms of conflict resolution? What have we learned from other states who do have open carry permitting?
Well, as I mentioned,
I'm sorry.
No, Chris, please.
As I mentioned, yeah, thank you. As I mentioned before, we've seen when permitting laws get looser, we see a 10-11% increase in handgun homicides. Now, from my experience, my experience comes from the military, right? And I know that we have two other veterans on this panel. It was drilled into my head that guns are used to take human life in my military training, right? That's their primary purpose. So legal debates aside, and it's been a robust legal debate that I'm trying to keep up with tonight. But legal debates aside, guns are not an idea. Guns are not intangible. They're not a right. Guns are physical tools. They are weapons that are designed to kill. I believe that anybody who owns a gun for self-defense purposes, including lots of responsible gun owners in Hawaii and elsewhere, they must be prepared psychologically and morally to take a human life if necessary, right? That's what you're doing in self-defense. If you're not prepared to do that, why have a gun for self-defense? That sounds really morbid, but the truth is it should, because guns are made to kill. Every week, somebody in Hawaii dies from a gun, right? In fact, across the United States, 100 people die every day. But before I went to Afghanistan, I was taught, I was trained and prepared that, along with everybody else I served with, everybody else I went with, we were prepared for the inevitability that we might use our weapon to take a human life. Most civilians don't take that lethality of guns seriously. They take it for granted, and they really, really shouldn't. But it's important to always remember that guns and gun ownership and the gun regulations we're talking about are all literally deadly serious issues.
Kainoa, I got two questions for you, and this is on the self-defense argument that you've brought up. Sean says, if your argument is to defend yourself, then shouldn't it just be one gun per person? Why do people need multiple firearms? And there's another question here that's addressed to you, which is, why not allow tasers or pepper spray for the public instead of guns?
Well, tasers are currently, well, for the most part, banned. There was just a decision that legalized them in Hawaii. Now our state is deciding on the ridiculous amounts of regulation to put on tasers for training and whatnot. But it's not for you to decide how many guns and what guns I use for self-defense. My situation will dictate that, right? And the Second Amendment is at its core meant to stop tyranny in the micro and the macro. Right, it's used to prevent tyranny. In the micro, that tyranny is self-defense. Some guy tries to mug you, you pull out your gun, and congratulations, you don't go home in a body bag. It is a very serious conversation that we're having. Chris is right. It is a serious conversation, and it's something that most people don't think about. But violence happens every day, and the CDC determined that self-defense uses with guns occur every year between 60,000 and 2.5 million times in the United States. Compare that to the 60,000 or so deaths, most of which are suicides. I think that it's a fair trade-off. I'll take that 2.5 or even that 60,000 on the bottom end of people using a firearm to save their life simply by brandishing it. Right, and this isn't about killing people. This is about the ability to protect yourself. Officers have the right to protect themselves. They have no legal obligation to protect us. We are obligated to protect ourselves and our family. So, I mean, if you would like to not be protected, that's up to you. I don't care. I I am simply fighting for the rights of myself and for individuals who do want to carry a firearm for self-defense. And if you want to carry a taser or pepper spray for self-defense, that's fantastic. Like Kevin was saying, it's all about choice, right? I want the right to choose. I want the right to choose what I use, what tool I use to defend myself and my family.
Well, Doug,
And
Real quickly, one stat that kind of is leaving out is that if you have a gun in your house, statistically, that gun is more likely to kill a member of your family than to be used in self-defense. I mean, just for all the gun owners thinking about self-defense, like that's a fact. And
Hey, I appreciate your every time
or
for gun
yourself
safety talking
or a gun
points.
suicide.
May I jump in?
Doug, I actually want to get to you.
Sure.
And there's actually two parts to this question. The first one is that Kainoa brought up law enforcement and their ability to carry firearms. If something like this is passed, and what do we know from other states, having been in law enforcement yourself, how does that change the calculus for law enforcement if we know that there are citizens who can have a gun, on their person at any time?
Well, I mean, I don't think I'm going too far out on a limb to say, I think a lot of people in the law enforcement community, whether they are the prosecuting attorney, whether they have been the appointed U.S. attorney, whether they've been the attorney general in Hawaii, or whether they've been in any of the county police departments, I think there'd be a very strong concern. I'm actually listening to what Kainoa and Kevin say with a lot of respect and with great interest, because it actually makes me think, okay, here's another way to think about something. It's just another way to think about, okay, so, a mass shooter like Byron Usui, nobody could have stopped him anyway, or if I'm not comfortable with, the less stringent laws in other states, then I guess I must never go to Florida or Texas or places like that. I think, so it's interesting to kind of be, and I think anybody who's listening to this conversation should realize that's the two sides of the coin that we're dealing with, and it makes people's passions go. I just happen to belong to that group of people that feel like when we have stricter gun laws, there's less crime. There's less crime that happens here in Hawaii. When there is violent crime, the violent crime that does occur tends to be domestic violence, and domestic violence often involves things where people are using a firearm or something like that. And I think that there's just that, I just happen to belong to that school. I don't know, I'm open, I'm interested in hearing these other ways to look at it. But I think at the end of the day, I think I feel the way most people here feel, which is just that, knowing that we have good, solid regulations that think about public safety, those measures being in place, it's not denying the constitutional right. I think all of us on this side of the argument respect the Constitution just as much and believe in it. We just think that there's another way to think about the Constitution than how it's being viewed. Will that ultimately be settled by the U.S. Supreme Court? For now, sure. That's what seems to be what's on the horizon.
May I follow on with regard to the law enforcement issue?
Please go ahead, yes.
Sure. Years ago, I was also a reserve deputy in Arizona. And I think that you're right, Doug. Law enforcement here would have to take a serious readjustment because they are not used to anybody having a firearm other than other police officers, active police officers right now.
Active police officers,
yeah,
right.
It would take a serious readjustment. But I can tell you, there's a variety of other states out there, a lot in the South and the Southwest, where law enforcement officers encounter armed individuals who are not a danger, they're not a threat, they're carrying constitutional carry or open or concealed with a permit, and law enforcement is fine with them. They interact with them. There have been numerous examples of people carrying weapons who have assisted and saved the lives of law enforcement because they had those options. And I just wanted to end with one other item here. You mentioned domestic violence. I think frequently, I find it interesting that nobody thinks about the woman who gets a TRO, which is a piece of paper, and she moves to another part of the island, and he finds her, and he brings a 2x4 or a piece of rebar, and he's going to club her to death. And she has a piece of paper. And yes, hopefully law enforcement will get there and they'll stop him or something else. But if it's just her and him, I'd rather she be armed, or at least have the choice to be armed. If she doesn't want to, that's fine. She can have a piece of paper or a taser or a baton or a firearm or all of the above. But don't deprive her of all the options is my point. And I don't think that the Constitution would allow, hopefully after the New York case, would allow the government to say, you must rely on 911 only.
Doug, I'll let you do a quick response and then I want to get to.
I was just saying, I mean, I appreciate it. I mean, I think in many ways, like what I've heard from Kainoa and Kevin, is like what I heard from the gun rights advocates every time I went to an attorney general conference or a lieutenant governor conference. I mean, these are the classic rebuttal points to what to me is common sense, or just just kind of a reasonable way to think about firearms. I think it's useful. I don't still think that's the world that most of us want to live in. I get that there might be a community out there where it works. I'm not convinced that that's how people. I don't know if Hawaii is ready to make that big leap, make that big adjustment. Maybe we'll be forced to start thinking about it more because of how the U.S. Supreme Court rules on it. That's fine. And I think ultimately, maybe the best place for people on both ends of the spectrum is to really just think about, okay, so how do we move the dial back and forth so that we can really balance things out as well as we can? For sure, we disagree on where we set that balance, but I think ultimately the community is probably more just feeling like they're safer with the way things are.
That they don't have to carry.
Avi, I have a question here from Lorraine, and she says she'd like someone on the panel to more descriptively talk about what the open carry law would mean for citizens, just on a practical level. I know that you laid out that there could be a variety of ways that this could go, but just in simple terms for Lorraine and for the rest of us, what would this mean?
Well, there's a vast variety already, as has been suggested. So it could be that you can just get a gun, and of course there are gun fairs, and you might get it without a background check, or it could be highly regulated. Hello, excuse me. Or you could have a highly regulated permit system or some background check. And I am glad that I am not in Texas, and things don't seem all that safe with all those people carrying. And we, of course, know that the NRA, as Chris mentioned, has been behind all sorts of guns which had nothing to do with the militia in 1787, 1789, 1791. And it is problematic that we have mass shootings, and those are not people protecting themselves. And so before we go, and Kevin, by the way, is right about Blacks and their rights. The McDonald case out of Chicago talked about that. But I don't hear the vigor about the other rights of Blacks and the other ways in which people need protection. And I would like to hear more of that from the Second Amendment advocates, and a little less about all guns anytime. Now, I think it is admirable that we have people who are trained, and I think that's very important. And one hopes that would be part of, if the Supreme Court opens the door, self-defense outside the home. But self-defense outside the home, as perhaps the questioner means to suggest, can get out of hand pretty quickly.
And Chris, to that point, there's a question from Tim here that I'd love for your take on, which is, first question, do I have a right to defend myself against a violent attack outside my home? Second question, if the answer to the first question is yes, does that not imply that I also have the right to possess the means to effectively defend myself outside my home? What about this self-defense argument, and that it extends beyond the home?
Well, so in order to have, be prepared for that self-defense, that lethality that the gun offers, right? And to be again, psychologically and morally prepared to take a human life if attacked. I'd prefer to use a baseball bat or something. That's what I keep by my bedside because I don't want to kill somebody, right? I've been to combat. I've been in that scenario. I do not want to put myself in that situation again. But let's put it in the context of Hawaii. If you're prepared to defend yourself, you're going to have a gun on you at any time because you never know when you're going to be attacked, right? So let's say you're someone in Hawaii that likes to exercise your First Amendment right? Freedom of speech, right to peacefully assemble. Maybe you're going to a Black Lives Matter march at Ala Beach Park, or maybe you're out in front of the state capitol protesting against COVID lockdowns. It doesn't matter what your agenda is. Just you're there, this massive group of people. Do you want some of them to be carrying firearms, loaded guns around you? Now, most people in Hawaii don't. They don't want that. But if you're someone who does want that, don't you want to also know that that person is well-trained and safe and a responsible gun owner? And it's incumbent upon our gun safety laws to give us that confidence, right? And what we are seeing with this case is just the beginning of what the NRA is trying to do. We see it in states all over the country. They're trying to erode all gun laws. Earlier this year, Iowa passed a law that both got rid of their background checks and implemented permitless carry. So now somebody who's not background checked and doesn't have a permit can just go carry a gun anywhere. Look what's happening in Michigan, where the protesters about a year and a half ago, they took over the Capitol, standing there with guns to protest their right to get a haircut during COVID. Had nothing to do with guns, but they brought their guns anyway, right? So in these situations, the people with the guns are using the guns to demonstrate that perceived threat of deadly violence, to quell the voices of people that they disagree with. It's essentially a group of people, a group of Americans who are hiding behind the Second Amendment in order to strip away the First Amendment rights of free speech and peaceful assembly from another group of Americans. And I just think in Hawaii, that's not something we want to see happen here. The way that I can, feel safe at a protest is that people don't have these guns. I think that, we take it one step further and we look at January 6th and we see what good gun laws did accomplish in, what was a tragedy. But if DC didn't have the gun laws that they had, and most of those people had been armed, and most of them would have been if they were legally allowed to, because they might get mugged. They're in DC, right? Those same people that were going to beat a Capitol police officer with a flagpole, they'd be more than willing to have shot him, and another one, and another one, and another one, and we would have seen many, many, many more dead on January 6th. It's just not something that we want in Hawaii.
Can I respond to that?
Well, actually, I want to get Kainoa's take on that, but before I get his response, I want to read this comment from Joel, who says, to this esteemed forum, half of whom are pro and the other half against, I personally feel we are much better off knowing only a small percentage of people, mostly in law enforcement, have guns on their hips or against their ribs. All others are lawbreakers. That's the way the majority in Hawaii feel. If it's not broken, don't break it by trying to fix it. So, Kainoa, is it broken right now?
Absolutely. And before we move on, I just got to touch upon a couple of untruths. There is no gun show loophole in Hawaii. It doesn't exist. We have some of the most stringent gun permitting requirements in the entire country. It's absolutely ridiculous. You need to make 3 trips to HPD to buy a single handgun. And unfortunately, we've just won a case against that. So buckle up. As for keeping a bat by your bedside because you don't want to kill someone, just as many people are killed with blunt objects every year as rifles. So if you don't think that a baseball bat can kill someone, you might want to do more research. And as for the Iowa background check, there is absolutely a background check in Iowa that takes place when you purchase your firearm from a gun dealer, just as there is with every single FFL in the entire country. What they removed in Iowa was the universal background check, which has been proven ineffective without a federal registration. And federal registration does not and will not exist in the United States of America. So, I mean, as much as I enjoy the every town talking points, please get facts straight instead of distorting the truth.
May I respond to part of what Chris said?
Yes, of course, please.
Thank you. So a lot of what Chris brought up, I'm going to characterize as consequences. There's legal consequences, there's mental consequences, there's emotional consequences. He is right that if you plan to acquire a weapon and you plan to carry it with the idea that you might have to not just brandish it, not just hold it, not just refer to it, but point it at a person and do what it is meant to do, which is take a life, then you should have thought about that. But whether or not the government is going to make everybody get some sort of training before they can exercise their Second Amendment right is something that I think ultimately the United States Supreme Court is going to say is not something that they should be included. We'll see if they get to that kind of granular detail. But with Mr. Heller, the fact that he had a weapon in his house and now he was able to have it in his house and by his bedside and not disassembled and unarmed and everything meant that if somebody broke into his house, he was going to be prepared to use it in self-defense and do what it's meant to do, kill somebody. And so was there some requirement in DC that he have gone through some training that they tell him when he gets it, hey, if you really mean to use this, you should think about that. Is it something everybody should do? Absolutely. What level of hoops the government has to set up so that some bureaucrat feels okay, that's something that I think we're going to run into some difficulties. And with regard to a second aspect, I think there's a a lack of faith with regard to the Hawaiian people, that if all of a sudden, June 1st, 2022, everybody who's a firearm owner, which, by the way, I think some of the people here are saying, well, we have a very low firearm ownership here compared to, say, Montana or Arizona or Texas or what have you. Well, then it shouldn't be that much of a problem. But I also think that just because all those people can suddenly carry a weapon doesn't mean when somebody fails to use their turn signal on the H1, it's going to become the wild, wild west. And for those people who can't constrain themselves, the consequences of, hey, you cut me off and you make reference that you're carrying a weapon, that's probably a crime. If you pull the weapon and you point at him, that's definitely a crime. And if you shoot it at him. So yes, there are consequences. The mere act of carrying, the bearing part of the right to keep and bear arms, should not be subject to the kind of suffocation that Hawaii and New York has placed it under.
We have only about 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get to each of you to get sort of a closing thought. And Doug, I actually want to give you this one from Rex from the Big Island said, would someone think less of committing a crime if more people had guns? Could this ever serve as a deterrent if we know that others are armed?
I just don't feel that way. I mean, so I get it. I mean, I think I've heard that over and over again, that, you know, I'll feel more safe if you know, I know people are walking around. I was actually thinking about Chris's example of like protests that happen here, and just how, and the fact that on the mainland, oftentimes, you know, it's the use of a firearm or the display of a weapon or something like that that actually is used as an intimidation factor. Like in other words, if I'm at an event, a large public event, and I saw someone or knew that there were people out there who were potentially carrying a firearm, I guess what I in this world that I'm hearing about, you know, I guess I should be thinking, good, that person is protecting themselves, and I guess that makes all of us feel safer. I'm not there yet, and it's been 55 years for me. I don't feel like that's going to change.
I feel
differently. I feel like I'm going to be intimidated by that.
I'm going to have to cut you off just because I want to make sure we get to each person, and we only have about 30 seconds for each. Avi, as we head into this, what is your closing thought for our audience tonight? What should we be looking at?
Well, I think it's right to fear the Wild West, and I think it's wrong to think that you just defend yourself by shooting someone coming in the door. In fact, legally, you're supposed to retreat if you can. It's not supposed to turn into a gunfight. And there are reasons for that. And one of the reasons is people are trying to defend themselves, the adrenaline is pumping, and they're not very good shots.
Right.
Even police have that problem, but certainly people who do not have the training, which Kevin doesn't want them to be mandated to have, it's a danger.
Kevin, how should we be thinking about this?
So I'm very hopeful, and I believe that when the U.S. Supreme Court gives us some framework next year, they're going to set a couple things straight. And that is, first, that the burden is on the government to show that whatever restrictions they're going to have is very narrowly tailored, and that a lot of presumptive restrictions, at least with regard to carry, because again, the Second Amendment is in its infancy, are probably going to start to fall by the wayside through lawsuits that come after that. And I think that's a good thing, because the legislature needs to take a more nuanced approach so that everyone has the right, the way it's envisioned, which is a robust right of choice and freedom to be able to defend themselves.
Kainoa.
Well, I think that the proof is in the pudding already. We have 15 states that have constitutional carry and 22 that have permitless carry. And in all of these states, the data has shown that more guns do equal less crime. I think that the unfortunate thing with social media, and especially with this pandemic, is how much it has divided us and further entrenched us in our bubbles. We don't hang out with people on the other side, even though the Hawaii Rifle Association and Lessons in Firearms Education has repeatedly sent out invites to people on the other side of the aisle, including legislators and newscasters, to come and meet the people that they are actually advocating against. That we've gotten very minimal feedback and participation, and the invite is always open to my friends Doug and Chris and Avi to come and join us at the range and meet the people who spend their hard-earned money and their valuable time learning how to use firearms responsibly and effectively to protect themselves and others.
And Chris, we have just under a minute left. I want to give you the last word.
Yeah, look, I'll take this opportunity to recognize that we have, two other veterans besides me on this panel, and everything I learned about firearms culture comes from my military experience. In the military, the firearms culture is built on 3 pillars: training, safety, and accountability. That touches really everything that we've talked about today, especially the accountability piece. I believe that if our gun laws looked more like the way the military oversees the way that they use weapons, and maintains oversight over who can possess a gun, why, and where, then training, the training, safety, and accountability showing up in our civilian gun laws would mean that we'd have a lot less gun deaths in this country.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there. Mahalo to you for joining us tonight. We, of course, do thank our guest, Chris Marvin from Everytown for Gun Safety, Kainoa Kaku, president of the Hawaii Rifle Association, Doug Chin, director of Starn, O'Toole, Marcus & Fisher, gun rights attorney Kevin O'Grady, and constitutional law professor Avi Soifer. Next week on Insights, October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, what you need to know about prevention, detection, and treatment. Please do join us then. I'm Yanji Denise for Insights on PBS Hawaii. Aloha.